All right, hello, welcome everyone. Welcome everybody who's here live. Welcome people who are listening later. Just instead of say which one you are today meme, I just found a different meme, right? It's that time of the semester now where things are really picking up the pace, right? You just made it through the midterm and now papers coming up. I kind of think of you all as been watching a lot of the Olympics. You might notice from my examples, but I kind of picture you all as right in the summer semester. Your athletes running, right? It's a shorter, faster race, right? Rather than having the full semester, maybe like a 1500, right? 4 times around the track. We've condensed this whole thing into just twice around, right? It's an 800. But like even in those races, right? You start off faster. We've been moving at a faster pace the whole time, but even still, we have to pick up the pace at the end a bit in order to finish. And so that's where we're at now, right? And I definitely understand that that's a stressful time, and so maybe you're feeling consumed by stress, but also right, you could think of this also, this is a really engaging time of the term. Now is when you're really diving deep into a topic that interests you in positive psych and your research review or into a book that maybe you picked. And so definitely while this can be stressful, since this is positive psych, we can also try to reappraise some of those high arousal negative emotions as more positive emotions, as engagement and interest as well. So just put that out there to acknowledge that I definitely understand that it's stressful. And in relation to that, you may have seen I sent out one announcement already today regarding final papers. Right, so I've talked to many of you about them. Lots of people are well underway. Some people are just getting started, but regardless, it seems like most people could use some more time. If you don't, that's awesome. Hand it in on Thursday. Check it off your plate. Enjoy your weekend, and way to go. Excellent self-regulation and time management. But if you're not quite ready yet, or could just benefit from some more time to work on this, I've extended the deadline for that paper until Monday night. So it was originally due Thursday night, and so you have the weekend plus Monday to work on that if you'd like. Why am I out of breath? Also, in interest of talking about papers and things coming up, and I'll announce this again at the end if people come late, but I'll also have more office hours today, right? Usually I don't have office hours on discussion days, but I will today. I'll just have it a little bit later, so at 3 p.m. and I'll stay as always until everyone has gotten their questions answered, and I'll also have office hours as usual on Thursday. So there's the link to that. And just the last thing I want to say about the extension for the paper, right? So I'm giving you more time to work on it till Monday, but I will not be available over the weekend to answer emails. I know that often I am, but this weekend I'm not. I'm going to be out of town and away from my computer. And so this is why I want to really make sure people get their questions answered. You at least should be thinking about your paper before the weekend and make sure you know what you're doing so that you can use that time to work on it. But know that I won't be available in the same way. So make sure you get those questions asked by the original deadline. Any questions about that? Anything related to that? Practice breathing. I'm a little excited today. Woo! All right, so a couple questions from last time that were sent in the survey. We just have a few this week. And so one of them, and this was a really great question that I actually had to think about for a while and dive into the literature, so thanks for that. This was a fun one. So this is relating back to self-compassion aspect of last lecture on the self. And so this student is asking about saying that the self-kindness component of self-compassion, right, one of the three components of it, we said that right, the goal of that is to be compassionate to ourselves in the way that we are to other people, right? With the implication that we are usually kinder to others than to ourselves. And the student raises the important point of this seems to contradict the fundamental attribution error, right? And so you may or may not remember this from maybe a social psych course or an attitudes course. The fundamental attribution error, right, is the bias that we have where when we observe somebody else engaging in some type of action, we're more likely to attribute that that action that they engage in is being based on their personality, rather than on the circumstances, especially when they do something negative. Whereas for ourselves, right, we're more likely to attribute that to external circumstances, right? And so that does seem to contradict, because that would suggest that people are, right, harsher to others in terms of their attributions about why they do bad things, right? It's a fault of you, you're a bad person, as opposed to myself, I'm more likely to attribute it to the circumstances. And so I dug a bit into this, how can we reconcile these things? And a couple points. First, the fundamental attribution error. This really occurs with, strangers, people we don't know much about. So we're much less likely to engage in this fundamental attribution error for people that we know well, right? We're more likely to see the situation around them. And so in those cases, right, we are more likely to be compassionate towards them. But also, just in digging into this, I found a really cool study, or actually it's a whole bunch of studies, and so I'm not going to go into all of them, but this was looking at self-compassion and how people react to unpleasant self-relevant events. And so the study I want to briefly tell you about, they basically gave people either negative feedback about themselves or pretty neutral feedback, and looked at how they responded based on whether they were high or low in self-compassion. Right, and so we can look at, this is not the fundamental attribution error that they're looking at here, right? But they're looking at, what they're looking at here is how much do you basically take this negative feedback as being based on you personally, right? An aspect of you globally. And so what they're showing here, and looking first at this top graph, is they're saying that they either got, again, positive feedback or neutral feedback. These are the two different lines on the graph about themselves, right? And how much do they say, yes, this is about my personality, right? How much do they make an internal attribution for that feedback? And what we see here is that people who are low in self-compassion, they show sort of the self side of the fundamental attribution bias, where they see this positive feedback is due to themselves, right? They tend to make that attribution, but they don't do that for neutral feedback, right? They see that as being less central and less based on their personality. Whereas for people who are high in self-compassion, right, they equally see those as part of the self. And so that's really a fascinating thing there, right? They're more able to integrate both positive and neutral information, but also see it as less globally central. Whereas for self-esteem, if you look at people's self-esteem, we show an opposite pattern, where people who have low self-esteem, right, they don't really see the positive feedback as being central to themselves, and they also see the neutral feedback as being more central than people who are high in self-esteem, who show more of this attribution bias towards the self, where they really see this positive feedback as central and the neutral feedback is not central, right? They derogate that and say the positive feedback, yeah, that's really about me. Right? Whereas self-compassionate people high on that, they don't show that same self-bias pattern, which is really fascinating. So there's less self-enhancement, but there's also less self-derogation going on there. And so this doesn't fully speak to the student's question about how we treat others, but it does suggest, right, that people who are low in self-compassion, see negative, because basically neutral feedback feels like neutral feedback, right? Because we don't want to be, average. They see that that takes more of a toll on them, being low in self-compassion than being higher in that. So really fascinating stuff here. Another question was just, can we go over how selective authenticity can act as a protective strategy, right? And so this was, again, from the self lecture and talking about, again, authenticity, right? We talked about how that varies within people across different situations. And one of the reasons that that varies, right, is different situations may or may not afford you a safe opportunity to be authentic, right? And this is particularly true with people who have stigmatized identities, right? It may not be safe to be yourself in all different circumstances. People may not treat you well for that. And so selective authenticity, right, can be a protective strategy in the sense of, right, as a transgender man myself, right, I may choose not to share that in certain contexts as a way to protect myself from potential violence or at worst, or just negative things that people might say. And so, right, people use, they make assessments of the situations that they're in and are more or less likely to be authentic based on that, is essentially the hypothesis here. right? And people do this all the time, but we particularly see it with these stigmatized identities where the costs of authenticity can be really high, or it can be quite safe and comfortable to be that identity in other contexts. And so this is something that we've looked at within SDT, and I showed you. This doesn't have a great graphical way to show this because this is again within person analyses, right? So it's a statistically complicated analysis, but what we're looking at in this work is we can look at lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals, right? They, may be more or less out in different contexts in their life, right? Maybe they're less out at work than they are with their family, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe people are very out with their religious community, maybe they're not, right? And so we can look at how people's outness, or in this sense authenticity, right, in the way that they're able to be genuine about that identity in these different contexts. We can see how that fluctuates, and what we see is that first of all, people are more likely to be open and authentic about their identity in contexts that support their autonomy, and it's only in these contexts that we see any well-being benefit to authenticity, right? And so, a lot of the research has argued that authenticity, always enhances well-being. Well, it depends on how people react to that authentic self, and this is essentially what we're showing here. This is what we mean by selective authenticity as a protective strategy, right? People know how people are likely to react and may make decisions about when, how, and whom to be authentic around based on that. Right, and so again, the headlines for this were that it gets better, but only if you're in autonomy supportive environments. Any other questions about last class, any of those questions, anything you want to address before we get into our 8th lecture here, Hard to Believe, where we'll be talking about resilience. So you can see that makes up most of the lecture. Really, the bulk is really getting into defining and describing the literature on that. That's been the biggest chunk of what's been done. But then we'll also talk about some more recent work on understanding and promoting resilience and more process models there. And then lastly, character strengths and virtues. So any questions? I'm quiet today. That's okay. You could be quiet today. That would be great, Gordy. Here we go. All right, so starting off with defining and describing resilience, right? So I want to start first with a broad definition, because as we'll see, resilience has been defined in many different ways. Before we do that, I just want to take a moment, right? I like to make you brainstorm things. So whether you're listening live or listening later, take a second to think about a person. You can know them personally or have seen them on TV, right? Maybe again watching the Olympics, I don't know. Think of a person who you see as being a resilient person, right? You could think of an exemplar, someone who exemplifies a resilience. Who is that person? If you're comfortable dropping that in the chat, please do so. Think about some resilient people. Terry Fox, that's a great one, yeah. And then thinking about these people, right? And you can answer this at the same time or separately if you'd like, right? What do you think makes them a resilient person, right? What do you think made them come to mind as a resilient person? Yeah, overcoming challenges to achieve something, that's a great thing, right? So Terry Fox has definitely done that in his own way. I'm not going to be the best person to tell his story. I know who he is. Dr. Metz knows a lot more about him, but I know that he's overcome, believe it was abuse, and in order to really be an advocate. And he didn't even yet give up on facing a lot of pain. I was thinking of, again, I've been watching a lot of the Olympics. There's a shot putter from the U.S. who came in second, and she, was obviously, she should be very proud of that. That's a silver medal, but she seemed like an incredible example of resilience. She said in her interview afterward that just a couple years ago, she was really considering taking her own life, and has had to really struggle to come back from that. She's also a Black LGBTQ woman. She didn't say which specific identity within that, but she's a Black queer woman. She's overcome a lot of obstacles related to that. And I think the thing that brought her to mind as so resilient was not just the success in the Olympics, but the joy and the well-being that she exuded in that. And so it's as Angela said, overcoming those challenges, and she achieved something. And then again, for my definition, I would personally add to that I saw this well-being aspect to that as well. Anyone else want to give any examples, right, of resilient people? Oops. I mean, I think there are very many, and I think it's easy to think of examples in sports, both because I'm primed with that, and also because those are times where we have a lot of access to seeing the kinds of challenges that people overcome, right? We can know about physical injuries and things, but there's also all kinds of resilience where we may not be as might not know as much about the challenges that people have faced. Anyway, great answers. And so part of why I ask you this, right, is both because I'm always interested in what you think, but also because this is really where the resilience research started, right, is thinking about how do we describe resilience, right? This again, is everything in positive psych. These are age-old questions, right? Humans have always been concerned about, right, what allows people to overcome in the midst of challenges. And so within psychology, this has started with looking at who are resilient people, right? Trying to characterize and describe that. And then the next step being, okay, but what makes them a resilient person? And then ultimately trying to replicate those factors and those predictive pieces in others so that they can also be more resilient. And so we'll see that tradition here in the research. So again, as I said, many things, it's got multiple definitions within the literature, and you read a bit about that in the 2018 NOBA article that really does a great job overviewing this very complex literature. But generally, and what we can agree on, is that resilience is a class of phenomenon characterized by good outcomes in spite of serious threats to adaptation or development, right? In spite of adversity that, not just any old adversity, right? Things that are serious threats to our ability to adapt to our environment and to develop optimally. So very much fitting with the definition that Angela gave there. Yeah, Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I know we'll probably get into this more, but in terms of good outcomes, is it like looking at like, trauma to regular baseline, or is it looking at like surviving to thriving, or could all these things have to do with resilience?
So all of those things could have to, so we will get into this a bit more, but that's a great question, right? So what good outcomes is, right? Just in the way that our previous definitions of things have been a bit vague, this varies within the different definitions. And so good outcomes can both be in terms of like the specific measure of that outcome, but also, right, is that better than it was before? Or, how does that compare to other people in your developmental cohort? So it can look at both those things, sort of whether you've recovered back to some ultimate, to some previous point. We see that more in like the adult literature, right, where you can look at people over time, but they're all still within like one developmental period. With children, we're more likely to sort of track them against developmental milestones in terms of looking at their resilience. So I don't know if that answers that well, but I do think we'll get a bit more into that. And then if I haven't clarified, do feel free to ask again. Right, and so like one of the things Alex was getting at, right, is the different, what are these good outcomes? And one of the ways that people have divided these, right, falls in part along different areas within psychology as well as these different outcomes, right? What adaptation means can mean different things. It can be an achievement, right? Specific, outcomes. Sometimes people look at GPA as a measure of resilience. Sometimes people look at, achievements like Olympic medals or other things that we use to really mark, a life of success. Sometimes we look at mental health measures like depression, anxiety. We look at those as outcomes of really a lack of those as being a good adaptation, and when those are present is representing threats to that adaptation. Some researchers look at physical health, right? Here we're within positive psychology, so many people look at happiness, right? That subjective well-being, that positive end of the spectrum. And then also, again, people also look at a developmental task, a success, right? Again, particularly in developmental literature, when you're looking at children, one of the things that we're looking at is, literal growth. Are children growing and developing in the ways that we would expect, or are these processes being thwarted? So we can look at different outcomes of adaptation, and then researchers also vary in the types of risks that they look at that represent threats to these adaptations. And so people look at childhood trauma, other types of trauma, neglect during childhood, the effects of poverty as a major risk factor, looking at people in war-torn countries, right? Obviously a major risk factor, and people who have been impacted by natural disasters, right? All of these things pose, major threats to adaptation, and so we can look at people's responses to that. And so again, right, there's many different outcomes people can look at. We're going to focus more on like this happiness and sort of mental health side of things, because we're talking about the positive psychology literature on resilience. But resilience is studied, and we'll see this sort of towards the end of this section when we talk about trying to integrate different research, but people study resilience from neuroscience perspectives, really looking at the biology underlying that. People look at the cultural influences on resilience, and so the next step is really to try to integrate these things together. Oh, and that's what I wanted to say here on this slide. Right? And so one way we can think about and organize this really diverse literature on resilience is in these 4 waves of research. And I don't know if waves is the best word, because they sort of overlap a bit, right? It's not like we've finished with one and then moved on to the next, but these are sort of 4 categories of research, and they are waves in the sense of we've built on each piece to get to the next one. And so we can start with, and this again is the bulk of what the literature looks like now, really describing, right, who is resilient? What does resilience look like? Right? What does that mean? What is this construct? How are we going to measure it? And who are the exemplars of this? What are we looking for in a resilient person? Right? And then the next step is to understand, okay, so how does this occur? Right? We've identified what resilience is. What factors and processes lead these people to be resilient? What leads to this outcome? And then thirdly, right, knowing some of these factors that are associated with resilience, how can we capitalize on those to promote resilience, and so to enhance resilience among people? And then lastly, right, the point I was attempting to make on the last slide is that we can try to integrate this knowledge of resilience across these different levels of analysis, right? Whether we're looking at the brain-based level, the interpersonal level, the social psychological level, or the cultural level, right? We can try to integrate knowledge from those different systems to understand resilience in more complex ways, and then be even more effective in promoting that. So first, talking about the literature describing resilience. Again, feel free to drop questions if you have them as we go. Right, and so again, we said many definitions, starting with the agreed upon part that it's overcoming threats to adaptation. But we can see, even break this down further, and I have a typo there. I see that's supposed to be an O, it's supposed to say or. The ability to maintain a stable equilibrium in the face of loss or trauma, the ability to resist being damaged or deformed by traumas or destructive forces, right? So one of the definitions is about really maintaining, right, this stable equilibrium, right? Not having fluctuations down in your well-being when faced with right, these threats to adaptations with some type of trauma. Sometimes also we define resilience as the ability to bounce back or recover from these traumas, right? So rather than maintaining a stable equilibrium, right, that impacts you, maybe it throws you off, but you're able to bounce back quickly and recover back up to that same point, right? And again, getting back to Alex's question, right, about how we assess resilience, right? Sometimes we look at people bouncing back to the same level. Sometimes we look at people maintaining the same level. Or sometimes we even are examining people who, not only bounce back and recover from these events, but maybe even grow because of them, right? And we'll look more at how that could occur, right? How could a negative event potentially lead to growth? And so some researchers look at, really one of these things as a resilience and call the others other pieces, and others really encompass all three of these things within the resilience literature. And we're going to do that for this lecture. We're going to talk about all three as different forms of resilience. Another point I want to make here, right, and this also relates to other themes we've had lectures of. Early in the resilience work, one of the main points that was made in opposition to, again, the dominant clinical work that was being done is that actually resilience is fairly common, right? We expect that, people faced with trauma, there's all of these negative outcomes. And again, not to minimize that does occur, but people are remarkably resilient. There's amazing evidence that children overcome great odds to go on to lead amazing lives and to be relatively well. And this happens more often than we would expect. And this is what we're talking about with this ordinary magic, right? And so while the literature has had a lot of evidence and work looking at those who did suffer because of early trauma, there's also a lot of evidence that doesn't occur, for everyone. And so this is what they're talking about with this ordinary magic. Again, that humans are, naturally resilient and find ways to enhance their well-being. And then I'm also going to talk about in how we define resilience. We've got these definitions, but also researchers can operationalize these in different ways. And so the ways that they've done this in terms of trait versus process. And so I'm going to dive more into that. But so just to say more about this resilience as ordinary magic, right? This quote comes from, Anne Maston, and she's one of my favorite researchers on resilience, and she's actually a developmental researcher, so she looks at resilience within children coming from all kinds of difficult circumstances. She does research with homeless children, children in war-torn countries, children facing all kinds of truly traumatic negative circumstances. And she says that resilience emerges not from rare or extraordinary qualities and circumstances, but from the everyday magic of ordinary normative human resources in the minds, brains, and bodies of children, in their families and relationships, and in their communities, right? And we're going to see this throughout in other slides in the lecture. She says there's really these adaptive processes that humans have naturally, right? And we've talked about some of these before, our ability to make sense of things, our curiosity, that we are that we are, inherently optimistic, and so these resources that children inherently have, and then also just deep resources of families and communities to support each other through these difficult times. Right? Certainly, families can be the source of trauma, but they can also be a major factor in getting people through this. And this is one of the things that she looked at as the amazing parents who are parenting children, even though they're homeless, and the way that promotes resilience in those children. And so, right, again, looking at this as really a form of ordinary magic, right, that this happens more often than not, that people find a way to be resilient in these really difficult circumstances. Letting my subtitles catch up. I guess that froze for a second. Okay. And so then I said there's two ways, or two main ways we've operationalized resilience, right? And again, similar to other things like optimism that we've talked about, sometimes resilience is operationalized as a trait. And so what we can see within this scale that measures trait level of resilience, the definition about bouncing back, right, and recovering from stressful events, right? But here we're assessing this, right, at a trait level. We're saying, are you the kind of person who does this, right? Rather than tracking them over time and looking at if they do, we're asking, based on your experience, are you the kind of person who does this, right? So you could fill this out for yourself, right? You tend to bounce back quickly after hard times. You have a hard time making it through stressful events, right? That's a reverse coded item. Doesn't take me long to recover from a stressful event. It's hard for me to snap back. These are really just asking you, right? Are you a resilient person? And so a lot of the literature did and still does use measures like this to look at resilience. Right, and so that's very interesting. We can use that to look at correlates of this trait of resilience. We can see what factors that's associated with, and we'll look at some literature on that. Right, but when we look at it at this trait level, it doesn't tell us much about. We're going to see it's going to make it difficult to answer the how question of how are people resilient? What are the processes that underlie that? Right? If we're considering it a trait, something that's stable, it's going to make it difficult to answer that question. And so, in part because of that, another way resilience has been operationalized to assess patterns of well-being or ill-being, right? Looking at patterns of depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress over time surrounding a negative and traumatic event. And then looking at, right, who, so both answering the who is resilient question, right? What are the factors that predict different patterns of well-being in the face of negative events? But also, as we'll see later, this also helps us to be able to address that how question, because we can look at what's occurring at these different inflection points. Or if we do interventions, right, we can then look at whether those patterns change over time. And so, right, so again, we said in the definition of resilience, right, there's three different ways we can look at this, and these are the three general patterns, right, that researchers identify as resilient patterns in the face of trauma. And there's a lot of evidence to support, right, that these are some general patterns. This is a stylized figure of those patterns, right? So this is not real data, but this is showing, right, a nice colorful version of what these different patterns look like over time. So we can say, let's imagine there's a stressor here, right? Let's say that there's a death in the family, right? And we can look at how people are responding to that trauma, right? And so that stress resistant pattern or maintaining equilibrium, right? That's this blue line here where you're not really shifted off, but you maintain a pretty stable level of well-being over time. The bouncing back, or kind of the classic definition of resilience of recovering quickly, that's this red line here, right? Where it doesn't take all that long and you bounce back to the same level that you were before. And then we have post-traumatic growth, which we're going to talk about in a few slides, right? Where you are perturbed by that stressor, but it unlocks some type of processes that leads to recovery and growth, not only back up to that set point, or not that set point, but to that previous point, and then over and beyond that. Right? It's also, right, so even without bouncing back resilience, if you wait long enough, many people do recover. Sometimes it is possible to have a delayed reaction, right? All three of these here at the bottom are not forms of resilience. A delayed reaction where the person seems fine at first, right? Maybe they're sort of muscling through and not really processing what's going on, and then show negative reaction later. There's actually argument over whether this is a pattern or not in the field, some evidence for, some evidence against. And then also certainly some people do show a lack of recovery, right? Something really bad happens and they're not able to recover from that. Right, so this is both a way of describing, right, who is resilient, right, again, but it also allows us to look at, okay, what's happening in the lives of these different people? Are there different, first of all, some people are interested in the personality differences or environmental differences that are leading to these different patterns. Any questions there? So we saw this graph previously when we talked about hedonic adaptation, right? And so sometimes this is used. Oh, good question. So Alex asked, so recovery to set point doesn't count as resilience. Not technically if it takes a long time. It's not the bouncing back form, but yeah, so correct. Okay, what am I saying here? Oh yeah, so we saw this previously, right, as some evidence for hedonic adaptation, right? And this was looking at, this was from that Lives of Older Couples studies, and they followed people over a really long period of time, right? And, sadly, one of the facts of life, right, is that people pass away. And so when you follow people over a long enough period who are married, some number of people's, spouses are going to pass away, some number of people are going to get divorced, things like that, right? So they, this is the, on average, right, people who were widowed during, right, so this is the year that occurred. You can look at this as the square line here, right? So there's a dip in well-being, right, leading up to when that occurred, and particularly the year that occurred, understandably so, right? And then we argued that part of the argument for hedonic adaptation, right, is that on average people sort of got back up, not to the same point that they were before, but they did recover a bit, right? But so this could be argued, maybe it's resilience, maybe it's not. But what's more interesting, right? This is everybody collapsed across everybody who lost someone over this study. Let's break down, right? Go into this one line and look at what are the different patterns that individuals had within that, right? Certainly not everyone followed this trajectory, right? This is just the average across everybody who was widowed. And so what we can do is dig further into this, and this is exactly what researchers did in this classic 2002 study, right? So it's the same data set, and they're looking at this same data, but saying, let's see what different patterns people had within this group of people who were widowed, and do we see differences in that, right? And so they had data 3 years prior to their loss and at least twice after their loss. And so, right, again, diving into that one line, breaking it down, okay, what are the different patterns people are showing? We can map those on to the patterns we were just looking at and see what percentage of people are following each pattern. And I think the first and most striking and important thing that we see here is that 45% of those who lost a spouse showed this resilience pattern, right? This equilibrium pattern. On this graph, being low here is indicative of good well-being, because this is a depression scale, right? Being higher on this indicates being higher on depression, right? But 45% of people stayed at low levels of depressive symptoms despite losing a spouse, right? So this does suggest, right, that ordinary magic of resilience. Here we see 12% did that fast recovery. This is what they're calling this, the bouncing back recovery, one by 18 months after the loss, right? 12% people fell into that category. 11% actually improved, were previously depressed and actually did better after that. And then certainly, right, again, not to minimize the effect of trauma, right, there were a significant number of people who were chronically depressed. Either they were depressed prior to losing their spouse as well as during and afterward, or some people who were doing quite well lost their spouse and then were still grieving 18 months later, right? That's 17%, right? So again, not to minimize these negative things that happen, but that's not the majority, right? The largest pattern is of stress-resistant or equilibrium resilience. That's just highlighting that. Right, and so this study showed one thing that we don't see in here, right, is we don't see that pattern of delayed grief that we had talked about previously, right? There isn't one where people, were doing really well and then pushed off that grief and then had a spike in grief later. They argue for this. I think they didn't really look long enough in time to see that, but they don't see, right, one of those kind of spikes like the delayed reaction where the person seems to be doing fine and then plummets. They didn't find people falling into that pattern in this study, and so he argues against that. Nano and colleagues. They didn't see any evidence of delayed grief. And another key thing that they found here, and this may seem obvious to us now, but was a big point at the time, was that it's not that these people who showed this resilience were like emotionally deficient, and that's why they weren't upset that they lost their spouse. They weren't unhealthy on any of the measures pre-loss, right? So before any of this occurred, they had just as good quality marriages as the people who didn't lose a spouse or as who were not resilient, right? It wasn't like these people, oh, the reason that they weren't depressed was because they weren't really happy in their marriage anyway. That didn't bear out in the evidence. And they also weren't rated in these interview contexts as being socially inept or cold or lacking in emotionality. The things that they were higher on, some of the protective factors, were a belief in a just world, right? So these people were more likely to see the world as a just place. They were more accepting of death. This helped them to cope with the loss of their spouse. And really a key finding was they had more instrumental support in their lives, right? More people available to help them do things, get things done, right? These are, again, our older couples, right? And so one of the things that you need is more support physically and to get things around the house or to get your groceries. And so having this instrumental support was really important, particularly in this sample. A lot of the classic work on resilience came out of September 11th in the US. This sort of gave people an opportunity to look at people's reactions to large-scale cultural event that was traumatic, right? And so you could look at people who were in the World Trade Center or around it or in New York, generally speaking, right? And look at their well-being over time in reaction to that event. And in part because some people, right, were already studying individuals, some people were able to look at their well-being prior to as well as afterward. So I'm going to show a couple studies that relate to that point in time. I fully expect that we're going to see a lot of resilience literature come out of COVID. And I actually know people who are doing that work now, right? Because this offers us another, this time not just in one country, right, but a worldwide trauma that we faced. And so we can look at factors that promote resilience in the face of that. So I fully expect to see more literature emerging on that once we've had time to follow people over time. And so, okay, so here they're looking at this first study. There's 75 people really and 55 who followed up over multiple time points, but they were all either in or right near the World Trade Center on 9/11, and they assessed them 7 months after this occurred and 18 months after this event. And they looked at their trauma experience, right? And so most of them were exposed to life-threatening danger or witnessed death and serious injury to others, right? That because they were there. And so what they're looking at here is very similar to the previous study, right? They're looking at levels of depression, and here they've put some nice helpful lines in for us. This is the clinical cutoff. If you're above this line, then you're clinically depressed. This is the mean in the general population. And so again, we see that 7 months after and 18 months after, right, 35% of people are falling in this resilient category where we don't see a perturbation to their well-being. Here we do see some evidence of this delayed reaction where 13% fell into category where they seem to be doing fine 7 months later, but then 18 months later were suffering more. Again, also speaking to the ordinary magic, we see 23% of people fell into this recovered category, right? They started off a bit higher, but they came back down really close to the population average and well below the clinical cutoff for depression. But then we do have a significant portion still, right? 30% who are here. They're calling this chronically depressed. We can't really know how they were before September 11th. So some of them may have always been depressed, but many of them, it's likely that this is in reaction to this occurring and still have not recovered at 18 months. But again, just making the point that, right, we focus a lot on PTSD, as we should. That's really important, and depression. But many people, and in fact, the majority have more positive rather than negative outcomes, or not positive, but they don't show these clinical outcomes, right? And so again, the interest is in investigating that further. We see the same pattern. This is post-traumatic stress diagnosis. Now here's the clinical cutoff, right? And so again, we see 29% are basically right at that. So essentially, or almost at the post-traumatic stress line, about 30%. But again, 35% are in this resilient category, 23% are recovered. Alex asks a great question. Do I know if they looked at the just world belief in relation to this study? I wonder what that would look like, making sense of something like 9/11. That's a great question. They did not do that. That would be a really cool thing to look at. But the belief in the just world, right? That's a great point. Is part of why that one of the mechanisms believed to drive that association with resilience, right? Is your ability to make sense with things, make sense of things, and people who are high in belief in just world, even though it may not always be right, tend to see things as sort of making sense or having a reason that this happened for a reason, even if that may or may not be true. So yeah, that's probably part of what contributes to the resiliency, but they didn't look at that here. This is another study, same event, right, looking at this, but again, just making the argument that people are very resilient, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but this is just basically breaking down. This is over 2,000 people who lived in the New York area and were there for 9/11, and then they measured these outcomes in them 6 months afterward, looking at PTSD symptoms. And so overall in the sample, right, only 6% met the criterion for diagnosis. 29%-ish had 2 or more symptoms, and again, the majority, 65%, had 1 or no symptoms of PTSD. Right? And of course, this varies based on how close you were to this trauma. Right? If you were in the World Trade Center itself, then that that's you're more likely to have PTSD. But even still, right, the majority didn't. Then you can just see that broken down for the different things that people were exposed to in this event. So we've mentioned post-traumatic growth, but I want to talk just a little bit more about that, because this is a fascinating phenomenon that there's a lot of research interest in, right? And as we mentioned in answer to Alex's question, one of the things that's believed to contribute to this, not only a recovery, but growth in the face of a negative event, is believed to be this meaning-making process, right? That could help us to not only to recover, right, to make sense of it, and that helps us to adapt more to the emotions, but through meaning-making, right, we might also further make meaning that we didn't have before, right? We might not only make sense of the event to get us back to the world makes sense, but we might even find a meaning that we didn't have before, right? And this is that theme that sometimes we see in seemingly cheesy country songs, right? The person has a near-death experience, and now they understand, right, how important family and relationships are, right? But that is a real theme, right? And you hear these stories anecdotally all the time, but research bears this out too, that what leads to post-traumatic growth is this sense-making processes, these meaning-making processes that lead people to make meaning and find benefits in things that they didn't see before. And so finding benefits and meaning out of negative events. And so one classic quote example in a quote comes from Lance Armstrong, right? And certainly a problematic individual, but he did face cancer and went through a lot around that. And here's a quote from him about his experience having cancer. And he says, "There are two Lance Armstrongs, pre-cancer and post. Everybody's favorite question is, how did cancer change you?" He says, "The real question is, how didn't it change me? I left my house on October 2nd, 1996 as one person and came home another. The truth is the cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me. I don't know why I got the illness, but it did wonders for me. And I wouldn't want to walk away from it. Why would I want to change even for a day the most important and shaping event in my life?" Right? And he doesn't go into this here, but why he saw it as so beneficial is that it reified the importance of some of the relationships in his life, right, and led him to reflect on some of the aspects of competition, right? And so many people talk about, right, being exposed to some trauma, losing somebody, feeling like or being in a situation where they feel that their life is at risk. This can lead people to frame shift and see their life in different ways. And also to potentially find benefits out of that, right? They might come out with a changed view of themselves, right? They might see themselves as stronger than they really thought because of the event, right? Maybe getting through that leads you to find a sense of strength that you didn't have before. Often facing trauma really strengthens relationships between people, right? So you might come out of a difficult event with really deepened relationships with those who you got through it with, and that can be a benefit that leads to growth. And people may also change their values, right? Again, going back to this kind of country songs or like narratives about these experiences, is that it leads people right to the Hallmark movie is now that dad is not so focused on his extrinsic goal of work and achieving there. He starts to spend time with the family because of this event, right? And this changed values can lead to growth and to enhanced well-being because of movement towards intrinsic rather than extrinsic goals, people pursuing things that are more intrinsically motivating for them, or otherwise just pursuing values that are more meaningful to them. So post-traumatic growth. One point I want to just make about that is with the post-traumatic growth literature, this is mostly looked at within adults. There doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of post-traumatic growth in children, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but because of that vulnerable developmental window, right, experiencing trauma early in life is much more difficult to recover from if those circumstances are not rectified quickly than things later in life. Because that's when you're developing your sense of self, the brain is developing, and we'll talk more about that in the different levels of research on resilience. So there's lots of different traits, right, associated with resilience. So these are talked about a bit in the article, but we've also talked about optimism, right? That certainly makes sense that would be associated with resilience, right? People who expect good things to happen, right, are more likely to, optimism is motivated and motivating, right, are more likely to persist in those types of situations, which can enhance resilience. And also optimism is associated with more positive emotions, and we'll see that positive emotions are in the context of Broughton and Build theory posited as one of the mechanisms by which resilience can occur. Self-efficacy is also a trait strongly associated with resilience, as is other sort of self-control related traits. And so again, we'll turn to a little bit more of this in talking about the levels of research on that. And so this, yeah, I'll turn to that in a minute. I shouldn't have put it on this slide. What I really want to talk about here is grit, right? This is one of the traits that's been looked at a lot in the literature on resilience, is often talked about in this section if we were using a textbook. And while it's not the same thing as resilience, it fits nicely here. And then in the last section of lecture, we'll talk about character strengths and the literature on that. So it's good timing for this since I'm tongue-tied at the moment, but this is, I would like to have someone else explained grit well, and so I'm going to play a short video of Angela Duckworth explaining it herself. And she is the researcher behind grit.
Grit, put simply, is perseverance and passion for very long-term goals. To say a few more words about it, grit is really about your stamina, how consistently you're working in a certain direction, then how hard you're working in that direction. It is not about intensity. I've had young people come to me after talks and say, well, let me just tell you how gritty I am. I spent 72 hours without sleeping, and I did this amazing thing. And I congratulate them, but I say, so what did you do the next week? And how many years have you been working on this? So when we assess grit by looking at people's biographies, for example, we don't necessarily look for bursts of unusual productivity or effort, but we really look for constancy of effort over time. I have actually for several years been grappling with the question of whether virtues like grit are only virtues in the middle of the spectrum. So do we have something like the Aristotelian notion of the golden mean, where excessive grit as well as insufficient grit are both bad? I've lately come to the opinion, and I really is an opinion because I don't have data to support this, that it's not necessarily that you can have too much grit. What you can have is grit in the absence of other key virtues. So, for example, if you're an extraordinarily gritty person who lacks judgment or humility or honesty or empathy and kindness, you can see where grit could, magnify ill effects. But I don't necessarily think that it's the problem of being a 10 out of 10 on the grit scale. Let me start off by saying that in our research studies, for many outcomes like finishing West Point, grit actually is more predictive than IQ or SAT scores. But I think the real question is not, which is more important or more predictive? What it really is important to do is to highlight the undervalued role of effort. I feel like we live in a culture where we talk about talent all the time. In fact, I once was asked to do a media presentation, and actually even refer to people as talent, as in, has the talent showed up? Did talent show up to makeup yet? Talent has to be on in 5 minutes. So this kind of obsession we have with, whether we are or are not gifted and talented, whether we do or do not make some talent threshold is misplaced. And if anything, I would hope that my research doesn't necessarily undermine talent, because I think talent exists. I'm not a particularly talented driver, for example, but we vastly underestimate how much effort, practice, time on task really determines ultimate performance. So resilience and grit, I've often asked the question of sort of how does resilience affect grit, or is resilience the same thing as grit? I would say that resilience, if you would define resilience as bouncing back from adversity, that would be one of the things that would be a precursor to grit. But I don't think it's exactly the same, because if you're somebody who, when things are hard, you bounce back, that is one thing that you need to be gritty, but not the only thing. You also need a passion, right? You also need something that you're really committed to working on over the long term, and being resilient doesn't guarantee that.
So, terrible music, but nice to hear from Angela Duckworth. So, just get this back up. And so, again, grit was a concept that was developed by Dr. Duckworth, and her idea here, right, is that grit is based on an individual's perseverance of effort combined with this passion for a particular long-term goal or end state, right? And the reason that it's so often linked with resilience is that it's this connection to this achievement and success, right? People who are high in grit are people who have, committed long-term to these passion projects, and really sustained effort to that, right? And been like resilient in the sense of overcoming obstacles towards that passion, right? And that's really the connection to the resilience literature here. But grit was really made a splash both in psychology, but also in the popular realm, right? So Angela Duckworth had a very successful book about grit, best selling, and there's been, because of this, right, interventions based on grit in schools, right, where they're really trying to enhance this perseverance and passion, and trying to get people to really focus on these long-term goals. There's also been a lot of criticisms of grit recently. And in particular, that it's not really adding anything to the literature because it overlaps with constructs that we already have. And so I want to, again, play a short thing and then talk more about some of these criticisms. And I've listed some of them here below. And you may or may not agree with these different criticisms. Oops. That's the wrong one. Nope.
Grit, put simply, is...
This is just a listening one, not a video, but we'll put this up here.
Support for NPR and the following message come from the House of Roll. Hit the play button below to hear director Kavita Khattri speak to the artisanship behind Roll faucets and fixtures, luxury designs inspired by art and architecture.
If you pay attention to education trends, you know that a lot of talk these days is about grit. This idea that passion and persistence are really important traits in kids rather than IQ or natural talent. And the thinking goes, helping kids to be more gritty makes them more likely to succeed. Now, a new study says we should care less about grit. To talk about this, we are joined by Anya Kamenetz of NPR's Ed team. And Anya, tell us first, how big of a deal has grit become?
Well, so the idea was pioneered by a researcher named Angela Lee Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania, and she did get a MacArthur Genius Grant for her work. And people in the education world, the business world, let's be honest, in the media, have hungrily picked up on this research because it seems to reveal a secret that there are these overlooked social and emotional factors that can somehow make all the difference in determining whether people are successful. And they're creating curricula for grit, they are testing students for grit in some schools and holding teachers accountable for it.
So now there's this new report that says, hang on, slow down. What does it say?
Well, so it's just one paper, but it is a meta-analysis by Marcus Crede at Iowa State. And he looked at 88 separate studies on grit. So, huge proportion of the research that's been published. And he found, first of all, that in one of Angela Duckworth's first foundational papers on grit, that she misstated the size of the impact, that she phrased it in a way that was really misleading in terms of how important grit is. And in general, Crede says that the size of the effect of grit, among other factors, is actually pretty modest. For example, if you're looking at how someone is going to do in their first year of college, their SAT score, not too surprisingly, their SAT score is more than twice as important as their score on what Duckworth calls the grit scale.
And so has Angela Duckworth responded to this?
Yes, she actually admitted that she misstated that effect size, saying that you're 99% more likely to succeed at something because of grit was a real misstatement. And she also agreed that across all the studies that have been done, that the effect of grit by itself is really like on the small to medium side. But that statement's a big contrast with some of the rhetoric, not only from her, but from others, other popularizers who have really talked about grit as the holy grail of success.
So is it that the popularizers took this and ran with it a little too far? Is that the sense you're getting from her?
Well, I think that there's going to be some recriminations to go all around because, Duckworth herself is a popularizer. She has a book on the bestseller list right now, the New York Times bestseller list. She gave TED Talks. She's been very, very visible. And even though her research and evidence is very grounded, but the more she talks about it and the more she talks about sports and talks about it, succeeding in all areas of life, the more it sounds like grit is really the holy grail, really is the silver bullet.
have to ask, I guess, with this new report, I mean, isn't this fairly common in academic circles? Somebody comes out with one idea, another comes out with another.
Yeah.
Pretty common, right?
It really is, Kelly. I think what's unique about this is just the speed at which research is getting into the policy sphere. You know, there's been a lot of interest and excitement in the education policy world in adopting the research on grit, on Grit's mindset. It's just a few years old, but already we're creating policy, we're creating practice around it. And so this is a really timely consideration to kind of pull back and say, before we go too far with any one factor, let's make sure that everything is in balance.
So I guess one question people might be wondering about then is, well, what should we teach our kids in the school, right? Should we be teaching them to be more gritty or not?
Well, that's the really important question, isn't it? I mean, I think that, you know, we're still going to be interested in social emotional learning, more so perhaps in the overall environment that a kid is growing up in. And so some of the most trenchant critiques of grit have come from people who say there's an equity dimension to this. If you talk about, you know, grit being a personality trait or a personality factor, it's almost like if somebody's overcoming huge disadvantages, that you're blaming them for their circumstances. And instead, how can we focus on the nurturing that all of our kids are getting in a way that enables them to rise to challenges and ultimately to be successful?
That's NPR's Anya Kamenetz. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kelly.
Okay, so they gave a really nice analysis, right, of this controversy in the field, right? So there indeed was a meta-analysis that came out, and very similar to, again, the other themes we've been talking about throughout this course, that said that basically some of these claims have been a bit overstated, at least in some outlets, right? That grit has being a very large effect, that the evidence didn't bear out on that. But the fact that it still had a small to medium effect, right, that shows that it's not a completely ineffective intervention, but it wasn't as effective as people believed. But also there's been some other criticisms and in that same meta-analysis and in some other papers that have come out recently that argue, right, so one of the things about grit, right, is that there's these two pieces to it, this perseverance of effort combined with the passion piece. And they actually looked at the factor structure of the scales of grit and said that it doesn't even support these two different factors to that. It's pretty much scores are based almost entirely on the perseverance part of it. And so even though the theory is about the passion and the perseverance, the measurement is very much of the perseverance. And in part because of that, there's a question of whether it falls victim to what we call the jangle fallacy, which is when, and I'm sure you've noticed these a lot in psychology, even if you didn't name for it, it's when researchers come up with a new term for something that's already been done, right? It's the jingle jangle, right? We come up with all these terms, and so the jangle fallacy is because it has a new term, it's something new. And so one of the criticisms has been that grit is really just conscientiousness, because conscientiousness is highly associated with perseverance, that's essentially what they're measuring. And we already know conscientiousness to be associated with things like SAT scores and GPA and success, because that's what it takes to succeed is, attention to detail and following through on things, and that's not particularly interesting. And so there is some evidence to support that, right? This comes from I forget how you say his name, Creedy's paper. And so what they're looking at here is this is the grit short scale. This is the original grit scale. And then these are the two different pieces of the factor structure, right? The consistency of interest and perseverance of effort. And what they're showing here, right, is conscientiousness of the big five personality inventory. That is 0.77 correlation with grit. That's suggesting that like 77% of the variance is overlapping between them. And in many cases, right, if I have two scales that correlate that highly, they're usually measures of the same thing, right? They're both like well-being scales. And so the argument is that, right, grit really isn't anything significantly different from conscientiousness, particularly because of its strong, it's strongly driven by the perseverance of effort piece. And we see this on both the short measure and the long measure. And these are just the correlations for the other big five. And they certainly show associations, which you would expect, but they're not so high that we expect that they're almost overlapping constructs. And so that's the jangle fallacy piece. Another criticism has been this circular reasoning piece that their research came from examining people who have been highly successful, and then they've identified the things that have made them successful, and it's not clear, right? Like the question is whether enhancing those things is going to affect other people in the same way, right? Is the fact that looking back, we can identifying these things not explaining myself well. Let me say this better. Okay. What was I trying to say there? I cannot remember what I was supposed to say about that, so we will skip that point. I am sorry. That is embarrassing. Okay. So then the last criticism, which was raised in the NPR little podcast thing, is that, and I don't think that this is at all what Angela Duckworth was herself doing, but one of the criticisms, and this is not just of grit, but of a lot of the resilience research, and we're going to keep talking about this, is that it is victim blaming. We've focused so much on individual characteristics of perseverance, of passion, but also, right, again, it's not just the grit work, but in other things we've looked at, right, looking at resilience as a trait, and looking at, right, what factors about the individual and what they're doing. Are they mindful? Are they this, right, really focusing on individuals over what they're doing to overcome obstacles, rather than the focus on, right, what are the obstacles that are creating these deficits in well-being, and how can we address those? And so that's been one of the criticisms, right? Again, not just of Angela Duckworth and her work, but broadly of this field. I really don't mean to pick on her. I do think that this work has added a lot to the literature, and as they said, right, this is always the back and forth in the field. Someone has something dominant, it creates something that becomes something that people want to critique with good reason. This is how science moves forward. So we saw that. So let's stop and take a 10-minute break here, and then we will come back at 1:24 and continue talking about resilience, right? So that was the longest part. I know that was just one section of the lecture, but it was the longest part. So we will keep moving forward next. So see you in just a few minutes. All right, any questions before we pick up again? Okay, I'm going to try very hard to be more articulate this time around. All right, so if you remember back to the beginning of this resilience section, which again is the bulk of this lecture, we had the 4 waves of resilience research, right? And the first was really the describing one. And the reason why I said they're not fully waves is because many researchers, again, particularly within the positive psych literature, are still sort of in that first wave, right? We're still working on that even as we move forward to understanding and promoting resilience as well. Right? We can still have disagreement at that early level, and at the same time have researchers using those different definitions to try to understand and to promote resilience. And so now we're going to turn to talking more about, by understanding, I mean, how does this occur, right? What are the factors that promote resilience? What are the factors that are associated with a resilience, and then later how we can promote that, right? So certainly these 2 things are linked. We can't promote something if we don't understand it, but the first step is to understand how and why and when this occurs. And so you've already read a bit about this when we learned about broaden and build, but I put it in quotes because there are many hypotheses about resilience, but the resilience hypothesis from broaden and build is that positive emotions are a key, active ingredient within trait of resilience. And what I mean by this is the argument is that people who are high in resilience, right, who tend to bounce back easily from difficult situations or not be affected by them, are people who readily experience positive emotions even during those difficult times. So this fits with broaden and build theory. In fact, is born out of that, right? The idea that, right, it's the positive emotions that lead people to build these resources that then promote a resilience over time. Right, and so the kind of people who are high in trait of resilience are the kind of people who are likely to experience a high degree of positive emotions, right, even alongside the negative emotions that they experience. And so again, taking advantage of September 11th, this is a case where they were already studying individuals longitudinally before this occurred, right? So they already had measures of trait of resilience. People had already filled out scales about whether they tend to bounce back and about their psychological resources, right? Remember that part of the model, so things about their social connections, their coping skills, their self-efficacy around different competencies, right? So different resources that they had, they assessed those. And then after September 11th, they assessed their levels of depression. Again, they assessed their psychological resources that they had, and then also the positive emotions that they had been experiencing over the past few months retrospectively. Right, and so of course what they find, and this is not news here, but this replicates, right, all the stuff that we've been talking about in the basic trait research on resilience, that having high levels of trait resilience, right, is negatively associated with depressive symptoms, right? People who are high in trait resilience experience fewer symptoms of depression, right? That's what we're showing here, right? And so the question from broaden and build theory is, does the experience of positive emotions, right, mediate this? Is this what accounts for this relationship? And so they look at this statistically, right? We've seen a lot of mediational analyses in this course, and so we're looking at another one here. And so what we're seeing is that psychological resilience at the trait level, right, is associated very strongly with experiencing more positive emotions. And of course, experiencing more positive emotions is associated negatively with depression, right? And what's important here is that when we put this in this model, this what was previously a significant relation drops to being 0, right? Positive emotions are fully mediating the relation between resilience and depressive symptoms. And so this lends some support to broaden and build theory. They also looked at, right, in the same kind of mediational model, whether positive emotions, right, mediated the relation between psychological resilience and increases in psychological resources. And again, I don't have the what the relation was before, but it was a significant relation. Having more resilience was strongly associated with more resources and an increase in those between before September 11th and afterward. And again, this was mediated by positive emotions. More resilience was associated with more emotions, which was associated with more resources. Right. So again, lending some support to the resilience hypothesis within broaden and build theory. And so very much a positive psych perspective on resilience, right? Really focused on these positive emotions. This slide references an issue that was talked about in the article you read, the NOVA article from 2018, and was talking about how in the resilience literature, and this can be incredibly frustrating for students. I remember finding this incredibly frustrating when I was trying to do my own research on resilience, that researchers look at the relation between well-being and resilience in very different ways. Right, and so we've already talked about, right, so within broaden and build theory, in some ways, right, well-being or positive emotions, those produce resilience, but then resilience also, right, produces well-being. And so those are two ways of looking at resilience in broaden and build's case, right? They build on each other, but some researchers are doing models where they're really just focused on how well-being predicts resilience, and others are focused on really how resilience and trait differences in that predicts well-being. To complicate that further, other models of well-being look at, right, there's some type of stressor that occurs, right? Maybe it's September 11th, maybe it's COVID-19, and that, of course, impacts people's well-being. But one hypothesis is that resilience is really what moderates that process, right? Being a more resilient person leads you to have fewer deficits in well-being, or maybe even increased well-being in response to that stressor, compared to somebody who's low in resilience, who has more of a reaction to those stressors. But importantly, being high or low in resilience doesn't just have to be about, right, these individual traits. Right? We've talked about that perspective a lot, but as we're going to turn to more in this understanding of resilience section, other researchers really come to understand resilience as being born out of, right, also the environments we're in and the supports that we have. So not just being something that resides within the individual. Right, and so I remember very well being in grad school and going to a talk on resilience, and the first person gave their talk and they showed this nice analysis of well-being predicting resilience, and then the next person got up and they had flipped those variables and they gave a talk about that, and I was like, well, which predicts which? And then a third person got up and they gave a talk where they had those variables in yet another order. And so this really is one of the struggles in the resilience literature, right, is what is the relation between resilience and well-being? And in some ways that question, depending on how you measure resilience, may not even make sense to ask, right? When we talked about our process models of resilience, the ones that look like this down here, right, where we are measuring resilience as a pattern of well-being, right? And so in some cases, again, to complicate this even further, for some researchers, resilience is a pattern of well-being. And so this has led largely to some of the definitional ambiguity and some of the controversy within the resilience literature, is how are we even defining this in the first place? And how are we considering it relating to well-being? Is it well-being? Does it predict well-being? Does it follow from well-being? Is it a moderator of well-being in response to stress? And likely, all of these things can work together within one larger model, and that's where researchers are trying to head now. So I mentioned on this slide, right, resilience, we've been talking about it a lot as a trait. And that is done a lot within the literature, but there are researchers who have long understood that, right, in looking at people's patterns in response to trauma and looking at who is resilient, right, and in describing that, have also been able to, right, come to understand what are some of the factors that are associated with that resilience. And here's, right, a list of factors that comes up over and over again in the resilience research, right? Things that help lead people to be resilient in response to trauma are having capable, effective parents. having close relationships with others. That's supposed to say relationships. There's a slight relation with intelligence, these that can help people to be able to more effectively navigate their environment. Self-control, right, being able to regulate impulses has been associated with resilience. Motivation, self-confidence, self-efficacy, right, so all these self things that are about, that are related to self-control, but also, right, about pursuing outcomes that are of interest to you and feeling effective in that. Faith, hope, and belief that life has meaning. This comes up over and over again, right? We've already touched on that a bit. And then also, we can look also at these broader context, right? The effective schools, effective communities, and effective cultural practices. And we'll turn more to these in talking about institutions in our, not next, but lecture after that. Right, so these are all things that come up over and over again as things that are factors that are associated with, like, who has these positive patterns of well-being in response to trauma, and not just a well-being, but other signs of adaptive functioning. It can be meeting developmental milestones, it can be success in school, other things like that as well, but also well-being. And so turning again back to Ann Maston and her work, she says this list of factors that comes up over and over again can really be boiled down to, these are all represent factors that reflect our natural, right, adaptive systems as humans. This is that ordinary magic, right? And so when those systems are facilitated and not thwarted, that's when a resilience can occur, right? So there's this natural piece within humans towards resilience, but also we have to facilitate that. We have to support those, right? And so turning, right, we think about capable parenting and close relationships, right? These are essential to attachment relationships, right? To forming strong attachments. These are a source of resilience, strong attachments. And shockingly, and that's sarcasm, so the other side of that, right, is that when our deep attachments are thwarted, that's when people don't thrive, right? It's that classic work with children in orphanages who don't have attachment relationships at all, right? They literally don't grow as quickly, right? So we can see what happens when these natural adaptive tendencies are thwarted, but when they're supported, that's when a resilience occurs. She also talks about, right, a learning and thinking brain and neurocognitive control systems, right? These map onto, right, intelligence, self-control, motivation, and self-efficacy. Right, and turning back to what we talked about before with developmental window, right? When these processes are interrupted early on, people can't make sense of the environment. Children don't know what to expect, and so they can't develop self-control, because why wait for something that may never come, right? If you can't trust adults, right, all these kinds of things set up the brain to react in different ways, and then can lead to poor outcomes over time. But when we meet those needs, and if we support children in gaining this type of mastery, motivation, and neurocognitive control, then this can enhance resilience, again, through enhancing this intrinsic adaptive system that humans already have. She argues the same for religion and spirituality and culture, right? That not only are these cultural things, right, but they're adaptive things that humans have engaged in, right? We have evolved to have culture and religion and spirituality, and that these are really adaptive to our resilience. And so, when these things are supported and people, engage with them in positive ways, this is a source of resilience, as well as, right, an adaptive system that we have. And same goes for education systems and community, right? We've created these as humans because they serve us and because they can be highly adaptive to our resilience as a society. Any questions on that? I know that's a little bit theoretically complicated, but again, what she's arguing is, right, we can take this list of things, all these correlates, all these predictors of resilience, and these really reflect these adaptive systems that we study across all of psychology. Right now we're getting way out beyond positive psych, right? This is looking at, like, really like the spiritual side of things, looking at motivation, looking at the neuroscientific side of things, looking at the attachment and relational side of things. Right? We have all these adaptive systems, and all of these literatures researchers talk about, right? We've built these things because they're adaptive to us as humans, and that when these processes are interrupted and not in place, this leads to, problems with well-being and positive outcomes. But when we can support these, right, when we can enhance these adaptive systems, that's when good outcomes can occur and when resilience occurs. And again, this is part of why that developmental window is so important, right? So if we want to promote resilience, right, particularly with the neurocognitive pieces and attachment of relationships, right, we know from those literatures that what happens early on has a lasting impact. And so in terms of promoting resilience, this is why a lot of the work is done in the developmental context. Many people are facing the kinds of difficult situations and traumatic events, right, that they are facing for a lifetime, and maybe they're born, into a family that is homeless, right? And so if we can, one of the main trends of research is, right, to try to give as many resources to help equip them with these other adaptive systems, creating environments where those attachment relationships can be formed, not taking kids away from parents, enhancing their neurocognitive control systems through educational opportunities, right? Things like that. Having strong educational systems can really help to promote resilience, particularly in these early developmental periods. Because that's when, right, those systems need to be most developed. But then it's not that resilience and promoting resilience later in life can't happen as well, right? We can also use these same adaptive systems and capitalize on them to promote resilience later, right? Enhancing our relationships with others can help us to take advantage of our attachment systems as a source of resilience. Right, we've talked about positive emotion as a mediator from broaden and build theory. So one of the mechanisms by which resilience can occur, and so we can, engage in strategies to enhance positive emotion. There's some evidence that laughter is associated with resilience, and so trying to create more situations and room for that to occur. There's some evidence that can help to promote resilience. It's also been interested in specific resilience training programs, right? Remember when we learned about learning optimism and training optimism? That was called the Penn Resiliency Program, right? The goal of that was ultimately to teach and train resilience through increasing optimism, right? By changing the way that people react to negative events to enhance their resilience. I mentioned before about training executive function, right? Particularly early in life, there's a lot of interest in doing that. And then also there's been interest in expressive writing as a way to enhance resilience, and this comes from the work on post-traumatic growth. I don't want to spend too long on this, but this is really just evidence showing that, tying back to what we talked before about with meaning making and making sense of things, one of the really effective interventions for helping people to cope with really negative events and with trauma has been expressive writing, where people really just for 3 to 5 days in a row write for 15 to 30 minutes per day about their deepest thoughts and feelings about a deep emotional issue that's affected your life, and you really just want you to let go and explore that. And so it's totally confidential, right? This isn't actually read. The only rule is that once you start, you have to keep writing, right? So this sort of gets people into that meaning-making, sense-making state of mind and helps to promote those processes. And this has been shown to be associated with both well-being outcomes, but also health outcomes, right? So people have greater well-being after this, and also fewer physicians visits for health symptoms, and also showed markers of healthier immune systems after engaging in this type of expressive writing task. So researchers are really interested in the mechanism of this, but the hypothesis is, right, that it is that meaning making and the letting go and processing of the negative emotions around that, right? And we said once you make sense of them, we're less reactive to them, and that seems to be what's occurring here. Right, and so turning back to this underlying issue that's been here throughout is a lot of these things we've talked about here are kind of individual things that people can do or interventions to change, right, the way that the person reacts to the event. And this has been, I think, the biggest criticism of the resilience literature, and really what for me personally turned me off to it for a while before I got deeper into it and realized that there was more than some of the stuff that I was hearing from some prominent researchers, right? But there's been this real obsession with things individuals do and can do to be resilient. And then the question arises, right? Why should people have to be so freaking resilient, right? Why don't we look at the contexts that lead to these adversities that thwart these adaptive processes that we've been talking about? And so, right, when we talked about that list of adaptive systems, right, a lot of these down at this end here, these are institution level things, right? These are not things that certainly we're involved in them as people and we have agency in impacting them, right? But these are not individual level systems. It's not about individual responsibility. We also have social systems that are adaptive. And so where the literature has been lacking here and across positive psych is in addressing, right, these institutional systems. And so we are going to do, again, more of that in our institutions lecture. I'm going to find everything I can that does exist on that. And so this is part of why the resilience work has been so perceived as, right, victim blaming, because there's been so much work on these parts that are really important, but much less on this. And the thing I would really add, that what I would add to this, right, about the culture pieces, right, it's one of the presumably adaptive systems of culture is that it is there as a support for when things are not going well, right? One of the classic quotes from Margaret Mead, who is a theorist about culture, is that, right, the first sign of culture is when they found a body that had a broken leg but had healed such that the person had survived, right? Someone had to take care of that person while they were in crisis. And so, really addressing the cultural and systems aspects of what, leads to adaptation and to resilience is really key. I remember very well being at that same conference. It was on resilience and health in grad school, and it was all the biggest names in that. And we sat through 3 days of talks about interventions where people went into impoverished areas and taught the parents about parenting or trained the kids to do these cognitive exercises or things like that. And I finally was very reactive, I guess still, but especially as a grad student, I got really fed up and I got up and said something to the effect of, do you think it's possible that all of the money you spent on this intervention might have been better served by buying these homeless people a home, for example, or renting them an apartment rather than teaching them how to parent? And that shut the room right up. And I didn't stick around too long after that. The person didn't really have a good answer to that, right? But this has been the critique. Again, I'm not saying it's not important to look at these individual level processes, but we need to not neglect these other pieces that contribute both to the need to be resilient, but could also be a source of resilience when done well. So enough about that, and I want to pause here to see if you all have any questions. I know there's not that many folks here today, but if you do have any questions, and then I want to spend just a little time talking about character strengths and virtues. There's not a ton of work on this, but I just want to cover the topic briefly. Any questions? All right. So the concept of character strengths and virtues is really something that was developed by Chris Peterson, who I've mentioned before, and Marty Seligman, right, one of the founders of Positive Psych. And this is both part of the reason for sort of both the prominence of character strengths, but also the lack of continued research on them. Chris Peterson passed away in like 2009 or so, and so obviously he hasn't done any more work on this. And Martin Seligman, one of the big criticisms of him and his work has been that he is very much about he has a center where they train this and sell certificates in this, and then they also their scales to assess these things are proprietary, right? They you can take them free online, but they don't sell you you have to buy the algorithm for how to score them, and so of course that makes it difficult to do extended research on them, right? It becomes a construct that's used a lot in business and marketing, but researchers are not going to purchase a scale to use it in their study. Right? If you're a researcher like me, you don't even have a budget for that. I'm not going to buy a scale if I could use a free one. But that said, right, because these are both very famous people within the positive psych literature, because they're sort of founding members, this is something that's had a sort of a lasting impact on the field, even though there hasn't been a ton of research done since. Every now and then something crops up, but in part because of who began this, it hasn't continued in the way that you might otherwise expect. So having said all that, what are character strengths, right? They're defined as naturally recurring patterns of thought, feeling, or behavior that can be productively applied and that are associated with high levels of functioning, right? They're essentially defined as, right, strengths that are associated with flourishing, right? Things that are characteristic of you. That's the recurring and pattern piece, right? Ways that an individual tends to think and feel and behave that can be harnessed and used in ways that promote flourishing and high levels of functioning, right? And so the way that these are really essentially they're positive traits that people can have, right? Traits that can be applied in positive ways towards flourishing. And the way that Peterson and Seligman have assessed those with what they call a values in action scale. And I think that the name of the scale really speaks to what they're trying to do here, right? They're saying that these character strengths are not only like things that you're good at, but they're things that you value, right? They're values that you have that you're able to put into action, you're able to act upon in some way such that, right, good outcomes occur. And so this is how they assess it with this values and action scale. But how did they come up with what these strengths are? Right, so they had to first decide, right, what are these strengths, and so how did they do this? They had to develop a classification of these different positive traits. And so they used a data-driven approach, right? Rather than saying, here's the different traits that we think that there are, they basically first came up with a criterion of what they would consider to be a positive trait. And by that, they mean like, what's even going to be a candidate as a trait here within our analysis. And so first they said it had to be ubiquitous in the sense that you had to see this cropping up across cultures as something that was talked about and viewed in a positive way, right? You have to see this character strength or trait not just being culturally specific. It has to, by definition, be fulfilling, right? People have to feel good when they're enacting this. It has to be associated with flourishing and well-being. It has to be morally valued, right? Again, it has to be something that's seen as good within different cultures. It has to be elevating. Elevation is sort of the emotion of like when you see somebody else engaging in that, right? It brings you up with it as opposed to like making you feel bad, right? As opposed to like leading to negative social comparisons, right? It should inspire, right? These positive traits should inspire others, right? Honesty should lead you to want to be more honest rather than making you feel bad. Whereas other things that might be positive in some ways, like ambition, are not elevating in the sense that they usually tend to not lead. They tend to lead to negative self-comparisons rather than positive ones. They need to also be trait-like and measurable. I mean, no kidding if they're traits, right? But that's still important, right? They need to be things that seem like relatively stable characteristics of people and ones that we can assess. For example, right, a trait that you can't really assess is like it's hard to assess like what someone's aura is, for example. I'm not saying that's never going to be measurable, but right now we don't have a way to really operationalize and measure that. It needs to be distinct, right? Different from other things. It needs to not overlap too much with the other constructs that we're looking at. And it also needs to have what they called paragons and prodigies, right? A paragon is somebody who is this exemplar of that, right? If this is truly, right, a character strength, we should be able to think about in our culture of someone who is really an example of that we hold up positively, right? A paragon which means in exemplar, someone who truly embodies that. And then we should also see prodigies, right? People who pick that up early and really excel in that, right? And so you see that early in development, that there are people who are, really high on some of these character strengths, right? We should see examples of those things. We should also see, right, if they're really valued, we should see that institutions are at least trying to, or saying that they're trying to enable these different strengths. And so then once they had this list of things that, criterion that need to be fit, they went out and sought a ton of different evidence and examples across cultures of, people who were viewed as being exemplars of different values. They went through a ton of different texts, all the different religious texts, dating back really far. It was a huge database of basically writings about, right, what is good and what is good in people and what traits are good across different cultures, and took all of that information and factor analyzed the different constructs that came up and through this statistical approach, which we're not going to dive into, but basically it's a way of taking, right, there's a whole bunch of different traits that people might have. We can see, how do those hang together, right? Are people similarly endorsing, one thing as they are to another, and then very differently from this third thing, right? So we can see what are the different, basically, clusters of values and traits that are emerging across cultures. And so what they found is, for doing this factor analysis, they found 6 categories of overarching values or virtues, and then some subsets within that. And so the 6 values are courage, justice, humanity, temperance, and wisdom. And again, these each have different subsets. Oh, and transcendence, I can't count. That was 5, and transcendence is 6. Right? We've already talked a bit about transcendence in terms of the values, right? That was one of the things that was on Schwartz's axis as well as Cassar's circumplex. And so, right, you can already see that that's something that they also looked across cultures to find those values, and you can see that here as well. And so then, right, there's 24 character strengths total that fall within these 6 values. Right, so you can see them all here, right? So within wisdom is creativity, curiosity, judgment, love of learning, and perspective. Courage is about bravery and persistence, honesty and zest, which is like energy. Humanity has got the love, kindness, social intelligence, right, connecting with others. Transcendence is like appreciation of beauty. You can kind of think of that as like, you're likely to experience awe, right? This is gratitude, hope, right? All these self-transcendent emotions we've talked about. Humor also falls there, because interestingly, that's a way to sort of frame shift as well. That's part of why humor is funny, is because it shifts our frame of reference in unexpected ways that then make us laugh. Justice, right? We've got some teamwork, fairness, leadership, right? Again, this is the way you interact with others, but more in terms of the transactions and exchanges as opposed to like the warmth aspect. And then moderation. These are all the ones that I happen to come out lowest on when I take the signature strength thing of particularly self-control and prudence, right? Those are right. So these are all about, right, trying to the self-control type of traits, and also forgiveness and modesty. And so this is their classification of these different strengths falling under these values. And so, because they drew these from different cultures, it makes sense that you would see these different traits emerge in different cultures. But this table is showing results from a study that just confirmed that. On the other end, so they took each of these different values and basically said whether it was explicitly or implicitly talked about in those texts, in those religious and cultural texts, and if there's nothing there, then it was not. And basically you can see that all of these, with the exception of courage, are explicitly or implicitly talked about in all of those texts. Courage doesn't come up as much in some of the Eastern cultures as it does in some Western ones. But so why are we talking about strengths and positive psych, right? How do they relate to well-being? Well, by definition, right, they enhance well-being, that they're related to flourishing, right? That was one of their criterion for determining these. But some are linked more to well-being, are linked more strongly to well-being than others, right? They all are in general, but some are linked more strongly than others. And these kind of break down into what they call strengths of the mind versus strengths of the heart. And I'll show this graphically in a second, but for example, some of the strengths of the heart are hope, zest, love, and gratitude, right? They're much more feeling-based than some of the others, like love of learning, for example. Just going to skip ahead and come back to that, but this is the way when I mean when thinking about strengths of the mind and heart, right? Psychologists, we love circumplexes, but that's in part because they describe data nicely, and we can see that these different 24 character strengths, we can plot them along these dimensions of how much they're focused on the self versus others, and how much they're focused on sort of thinking and cognitive pieces versus the heart or more affective pieces. And so, right, gratitude and love are very close to the heart end of things, whereas judgment, self-control are more up on the mind end of things. Self has, right, love of learning, creativity are more focused on the self, whereas like leadership and teamwork are more focused on others. I'm not saying that these things are selfish per se, right, but they're more about like self-growth and self-actualization, and as opposed to explicit focus on others. And so again, what I was saying is that that all of these character strengths are associated with well-being, but particularly these ones here, like hope, zest, love, and gratitude, are most strongly associated with well-being. So if you're doing the positivity exercises, you can do the strengths exercises. It's honestly, it feels like doing a BuzzFeed quiz or something. It's kind of fun, and it's going to ask you a bunch of questions about yourself, and it determines your strengths. And again, because these are proprietary, it won't tell you how it scored this, but it'll give you a rank order of your different strengths. So you don't actually know how, what your score is on each one, but you can see like which is your top strength. So for example, when I took this, I learned that my top strength is my ability to love and be loved, and my second is my love for learning. And I definitely resonate with both of those. And my thing at the very bottom was self-control and zest. And I think that's not surprising to me either. Zest has items like it's easy for me to get out of bed in the morning, and that's definitely not true. And so you can see your rank ordering of your strengths, right? And the goal of this strengths approach in positive psych is that, we often think about, if we want to grow as people, we need to address our deficits. And that is true. But another thing we can do is try to identify our strengths and then really capitalize on those, really enhance those. And I realized I got ahead of myself because I wanted to come back to this slide, right? And that's what I'm trying to say here is, right, that the goal of this is to identify our values and preferences, because these tend to be consistent with our strengths, right? My values and preferences are to learn a lot and to be engaged academically and intellectually, and that's why I love teaching, and that is consistent with the strengths that are identified for me. And so, right, the goal in the interventions based on signature strength, and we see these in the workplace a lot, is to identify these strengths and then help people to find ways to capitalize on those and to engage in those more as a way to further enhance their well-being. Alex asks, does it mean anything that most of the heart ones are also very close to the middle for self and other? That's a great question. I don't know if that means anything in particular. I think that that's an interesting observation. It's a little bit counterintuitive to me, almost just looking at this, that love wouldn't be a little bit more on the other side because it's got that focus, but of course also you feel the love, and so I think that's probably hard to disentangle. But I will say, like, from other research, we do know that one of the strongest predictors of well-being is like social connection and stuff, so that would suggest that it's kind of these other focused heart emotions most that do predict well-being, but also zest. And I think part of why zest does so much is that a lot of the items are kind of getting at like your vitality or like your energy, and that is, you know, one is strongly related like to our assessment of how our life is going and our physical health as well. And so that may be part of why that has such a strong association with well-being as well. But certainly there's more research to do there. That's just what the show is, that on average right now, these ones, the ones with the heart, are more associated with well-being than the others. Again, not that those aren't, but the strength of the association is stronger. So if you do the exercise, right, there's a few different places you can do that. I have a couple different links just because with these ones, they give you a little more info, but you do need to log in. Right? You don't have to, they just, that means you give like your email, I think. They don't email you, but I understand why you wouldn't want to do that. I don't like doing that. So this one is one that, this last one totally works for the exercise, gives you the list of strengths, but you don't need to give any information other than, you know, answering the questions. So you'll do that. Then you will think about, you know, how you can apply those strengths. Oops, I accidentally clicked on it. No, that opened. So you can and then answer questions about, you know, how you already apply that, how you could do more of that, and brainstorm around that and do a reflection, right, like you normally do. So that gets us here to the end, right? So ending with some learning outcomes. I know we've gone through a lot of theory and research today, but the goal of this, right, is to be able to describe the various ways that we've talked about resilience, how researchers have defined this in the literature. And in doing so, right, being able to talk about, right, how this affects the research and theory that we have on how we can promote and understand resilience, right? So how the definitions, like, so how we've defined it, how we understand about promoting it, but also how those two things link together is a good thing to be able to understand. And then lastly, right, we talked about character strengths, so really being able to define what those are and how they relate to well-being outcomes. And there's much less that we talked about there, again, because there just is much less in the literature, but still a really interesting thing. And honestly, I think it's kind of fun to take those, and we all like to learn about ourselves. And so I find that exercise enjoyable, and students have reported liking it. Like, who doesn't want to hear what our strengths are? We hear so much about what we need to improve on. It's nice to know what we do well and then try to approach that. So announcements, right, I said this at the beginning, but we've extended the deadline for the final paper just to give everybody a bit more time. And so, but just again, as a reminder, right, I will be available to answer questions up until the original due date, but then I will, unfortunately, and this is, you know, just bad timing on this with the extension, but that shouldn't prevent you from having the extension, but I won't be available that weekend to answer questions. So make sure you use office hours over the next few days or email to contact me so you can get any questions you have about the papers answered before the weekend. So I'll be having office hours today. I know I don't usually have office hours on discussion days, but I will have them after the discussion ends at 3. So I will, you know, be on GatherTown, and then I also will hold them on Thursday as well. So there'll be chances to talk more about papers. Other announcements, right? Just if you're an asynchronous discussion group, right? That's we started one last week, so that's wrapping up on Thursday. So make sure that you participate in that. The discussion 3, right, that starts today. So synchronous groups are talking about that shortly, and asynchronous groups, right, that leaders should be posting their questions, you know, now, and then they'll be talking about that asynchronously. Right, so for the asynchronous groups, these are going to overlap a little bit, right? Because if I'm giving you a week for each, but we only have 6 weeks in the term, they're going to have to overlap a little bit. So just make sure that you do both of those. If you're doing positivity exercises, right, the mindfulness one that we started a while ago is due tonight. Self-compassion, that'll be due on Thursday, right, because it was a week from last Thursday. And then the strengths one, you know, starts today. And so that would be due next Tuesday. So just, again, letting you know what those are. And they come quickly just because the term comes quickly. But each of these, they shouldn't take you too long to do. And hopefully it's something that brings its own reward as well as the grade. the asynchronous discussion closes Thursday, or the leader assignment is due Thursday. Let me make sure I don't say this wrong before. The discussion was on this. Yeah, it's the discussion board closes Thursday because it's the one that goes with the self lecture, right? And we had that on Thursday. Days of the weeks got confusing for me for a minute, and so the discussion board is open for a week, and then you have 48 hours after that closes to submit the written assignment for the leader. And then there's not, I don't have a ton to say here, although I'm happy to answer any questions if people have them. But I did, we posted the midterm grades. I'm sure you saw the class did very well overall. We had a 76% average, and right, that's high both because people did very well at the top, but also right with these kind of assessments, you don't get the same kind of thing that happens with multiple choice stuff where people totally bomb, right? Most people did tell me quite a few things that they learned, and so we don't have people failing, which is really awesome. That's why I like this type of testing. It really gives you a chance to show what you have learned, and so I just congratulate you all on doing that, right? I think that I'm really impressed by how well everybody did. Just again, what distinguished sort of good from exceeding expectations, again, is just really the clarity of explanation, right? A lot of people sort of danced around things or mentioned something, but it wasn't really clear what that was, or it was explained in a way that was difficult to follow. Logical construction of arguments. Some people didn't really construct an argument at all, just kind of said some things that were true and were good information, and certainly you got points for that, right? But what makes something really excellent is making really clear connections between the point you're making and the literature you're talking about. And so that was a piece really showing deep understanding of theory, right? So certainly gave points to people for mentioning theory and telling about the basics, but where you really demonstrated, right, that you understood more of the nuances of that, or for example, in talking about intrinsic motivation and intrinsic and extrinsic goals, right, understanding that those are certainly related constructs, but they're not the same thing, right, as opposed to just sort of lumping those together, which is fine. They are related, but a deep understanding shows an understanding of like the differences and the nuances there. Examples is another way to really differentiate good from exceeding, right? And so it's not just whether you have examples or not, but do those really like illustrate the point really well? Are they compelling? If it's an empirical example, does it fit with the point you're making, right? Some people told me about studies, but it's like, I don't really know if that's a good example here. That doesn't really support your point, right? And so making sure that your examples were chosen well in that way. And specific enough that they like made sense. And this also is for the real world examples, right? Certainly you can use those as well, but some people use some and I'm like, it's not really clear exactly how that's an example of that, or it's kind of vague. And so like really trying to come up with things that, again, illustrate the point well. And then lastly, unique insights is really where you get those very top scores, is where someone's really saying something that right is not something that I directly talked about, but is something that that shows that they deeply understand the literature and have like made a connection there, right? And that's really what gives you a score in the 9 or above, is by adding that unique insight piece. And it doesn't have to be like a totally new idea, but like a new way of talking about it, an interesting way of saying it, an example that I haven't seen before that I didn't give in class. Things like that is what I mean by the unique piece, right? You don't have to be totally original. I'm not expecting you to solve the problem that we're talking about here, but it shows, right, individual thought and insight. Any questions? Any questions there? And I certainly, welcome questions about things more specifically as well, one-on-one over email or office hours, things like that. And then just lastly, you have still a while left to do this, but I can't believe it's already time for this, but I got the email that the course evaluations are open, and so this is your chance to evaluate me. I have lots of chances to evaluate you, but this is, one of your, or really your only chance to do so for me. And I really, this is important to me. I really do value that feedback. I read it closely. I make decisions based on that. I change things every term based on what students said. The things that we do in this class are very much based on past feedback from students. The amount of choice that you have, the fact that we even have positivity exercises comes from feedback from past students. So I really do value and appreciate that feedback, both for my own personal growth, but also for some, more extrinsic goals and outcomes of, applying for jobs, right? I'm trying to stay at U of T, and I have to apply for a new job this fall there. And so this is the evidence that I take with me in my package to say, yes, I can teach, and look, students don't hate me, hopefully. And so again, I'm not asking for any specific feedback on this, right? I want you to fill this out honestly and give me your real opinion. But I really do use this, again, both for my own growth, but also as part of my teaching portfolio. And it's important to have people actually answer the questions so that they know, even if you've improved and even if something was a struggle, right, I still have the data to speak to that. So please, please, please fill those out. They're due August 17th. So again, you have some time, but don't forget to do those, and I will remind people. Because again, please, 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 I need it. So that's it for new content today. So thank you all very much. I know you're off to your synchronous discussions, but I will stick around if anybody has any questions, and then I'll pop over and drop in on folks there, and then at 3 be over in GatherTown for office hours for anyone who has questions about anything. So thanks so much, and have a good rest of your day.